So I'll give a minute or two for everyone to connect. Great, I see people connecting, so that's fantastic. And on that note, we'll start today's webinar. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the third webinar of 2022. My name is Sally, and I am the Scholarly Communications Manager here at My Science Work. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with My Science Work, we've been around for well over a decade. We've been promoting open access and open science for, across multiple facets, including the popularizing of research outputs and projects, helping research institutions with open science, data-driven repositories, and also with complementary analytical solutions for scholarly content. So naturally, today's topic is something that really resonates with us and our community, and it's great to see some 200 registrants representing different continents actively pursuing these topics. So that's fantastic. The goal of today's webinar is to bring into discussion the still prevalent challenges and also lessons learned moving forward with institutional repositories. So we welcome you all to use the chat option to comment and share your opinions, and to please use the Q&A option to address the questions you have for the panelists. And also please know that the webinar is being recorded, so you can access it at a later date or share it with your colleagues. And the slides shared by the panelists today will be made available in the webinar replay, which will be published on the My Science Work YouTube channel and will be accessible throughout our social media channels, that is the LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook accounts of My Science Work. So I invite you all to follow us on our social media channels, and that way you can also stay connected with us and address any questions you have, and also be informed of future webinars. Please also mute your microphones during the presentation, but you are more than welcome to turn on your video and microphone during the Q&A sessions and to hop into the conversation. We are extremely fortunate to have with us today Kathleen Shearer and Rob Johnson. Kathleen has been the Executive Director of CORE, that is the Confederation of Open Access Repositories, since 2013, and she has been working in the area of open access, open science, scholarly communications, and research data management for some 20 years. As a part of the Next Generation Repositories project, CORE has been working on promoting and profiling a distributed model in which peer review and other types of assessment can be linked to preprints managed in different repositories. Kathleen is an active member in many initiatives related to open science, such as the RDA, that is the Research Data Alliance, and she's also a research associate with the Canadian Association of Research Libraries. So thank you for being here, Kathleen. Moving to Rob Johnson. Rob is the founder and the director of Research Consulting, which is a mission-driven business which works to improve the effectiveness and the impact of research and scholarly communication. Rob began his career as a consultant with the KPMG, where he spent 4 years as head of research operations at the University of Nottingham, UK. And since founding Research Consulting in 2013, he has led more than 100 projects in the field of scholarly communication, serving universities, funders, publishers, vendors, and software suppliers. Rob is a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. He's also a trainer for the European Association of Research Managers and Administrators, and has served as an independent reviewer and evaluator for the European Commission's Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe programs. He was the lead author of the STM report back in 2018, which is a comprehensive overview of the scientific and scholarly publishing industry. Over the last decade, he has advised a wide range of universities, governmental and intergovernmental bodies on the transition to open access and open data. So naturally, given the extensive experience and affiliations that you both had, it's a fantastic to have you both here today presenting your thoughts. With open source, and then there's also low code and no code on the rise, the installation of institutional repositories have been to a great extent streamlined. The challenges, we can say, start to pick off from the tailoring of the software. Then you have the setting up of the services. And then there's, of course, the policies, the procedures pertaining to its successful implementation. Rob, you have a strong background not only in academia, but also private and government. I would like to sort of start this webinar listening to your thoughts on first, perhaps the sustainability and the viability for institutional open access repositories, and then sort of we can narrow it down to the barriers related to increased data and research output management. Rob.
Thank you, Sally, and really good to be with you all today, and yeah, looking forward to hearing what Kathleen has to say after me as well. So I guess picking up some of those questions about the sustainability and the role of repositories, what I wanted to do was just share a few slides, I guess giving sort of the big picture as I see it, and some of the challenges that will influence the direction of open access repositories going forward. So I'll share my slides and just talk you through those. So what I wanted to do was just pick up 3 key challenges for open access repositories, which I see emerging in the landscape. So I'm by no means a specialist in repositories, but they crop up a lot in the work that we do for the libraries, for institutions, also for funders, and in the wider scholarly communication ecosystem. So the 3 things I wanted to talk about today were reproducibility, changes in the policy landscape, and platform capitalism. And I'll explain what I mean by each of those as I go through them. So just to begin with reproducibility, it's a word that's used a lot. It's used somewhat interchangeably with replicability sometimes as well. But this idea of reproducible research is something that's really been gaining ground over the last few years. And by reproducible research, I mean, if someone takes the same data and they undertake the same analysis, they will get the same results at the end of the day. And I'll refer to a couple of projects I've worked on in recent years. So one is what you see in the bottom right of the screen there. It's a project we undertook for Knowledge Exchange. That's a group of technology and infrastructure providers in Europe, looking at what's involved in publishing and sharing reproducible research outputs. And clearly the key thing is you have to go beyond simply sharing a publication. You need to have the data, you need to have the code, methodologies, protocols, a number of other research outputs that need to be shared alongside, or ideally in advance of the formal peer-reviewed publication, for research to qualify as reproducible. And so for repositories, the question is really, what is the role of repositories in enabling that process? And I think, of course, there's a number of other places that people can put their data, that can put their code, and in many cases those are discipline or subject specific. But the role of institutional repositories is often filling the very significant gaps where there is no disciplinary solution or similar. So just to refer to another project we were involved in over the last couple of years, as it turned out over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, we were undertaking some research with the University of Oxford, looking at how Oxford supported research data. Now, what I've got on the screen there's an awful lot of things on that slide. That was the services that were being used by Oxford researchers to manage and share their research data. As you can see, we map that in terms of a life cycle, going from active data, semi-active, archived data, looking at cataloging and registries, advice, guidance, and consultancy. What I'll pick out is what at Oxford is called Aura data. That's the Oxford Research Archive for data. And the main use cases for that as an institutional repository were around the archiving of data, but also increasingly cataloging of data. So one of the challenges I think many institutions are facing as they try to move towards more reproducible research is just knowing, well, what are the data assets that our researchers are producing? And in some cases, the repository can be a means of hosting those data assets, but also just holding metadata and giving some visibility into those. So I think that point about repositories needing to move beyond simply holding journal articles or working papers to a wider range of outputs is a really crucial one, and it's being driven by that demand for reproducible research. And again, there's sources there. I think Sally's sharing the links to those documents if you'd like to see more information on those. Now, what's driving that shift to reproducibility? Well, there's a number of elements, but one of them clearly is the policy landscape. So what are public policy makers, what are research funders asking of researchers, asking of institutions? So in terms of that policy landscape, there's two other things I'm just going to pick out. These are quite region specific, but I think they reflect a number of tendencies that we see internationally. So that the first one is what's called the Coalition S rights retention strategy. So some of you may well be aware of Coalition S. It's a group of predominantly, but not solely, European funders that have set out a plan to move to immediate open access. And actually repositories have a really central role to play in this through what's on screen here in terms of the rights retention strategy. So the Coalition S supports publishing open access on the publisher's platform, what's traditionally called gold open access, but in various circumstances that may not be possible. Not every journal is eligible, not every journal offers a pathway. So the rights retention strategy is about giving researchers the ability to share their work open access with no embargo through a repository. And obviously that positions those institutional repositories as having quite a central role in the implementation. Now you can see on this slide, this is relatively complex, and this is the sort of Coalition S's attempt to get it all onto a single page, but essentially the researchers have to apply a license to their manuscript before they submit it to the publisher, so that it effectively preempts any copyright transfer agreement that may be put in place with the publisher by saying, I've previously applied a CC BY public copyright license to my manuscript. That then enables the researcher, or perhaps more likely a librarian in their institution, to deposit that author's manuscript to a repository, irrespective of whatever terms are in place with the publisher. Now, this is getting into quite grey and complex legal territory as to exactly what are the legalities around this, and a lot's been written on this online. So this is a challenge, I think, for repositories in that it positions them in quite a central place in the landscape, but it also exposes them to additional questions and risks in terms of the legalities. So moving on to another element of the policy landscape, again, I just picked one example here. So UK Research and Innovation is essentially the main national funder of research in the UK, where I'm based. They've recently announced a new open access policy, and as part of that, for the first time, they're introducing open access requirements for what they call long form publications, but what most of us would refer to as books. And this is part of a trend that we're seeing across many parts of Europe and internationally to moving beyond open access to peer-reviewed journal articles or conference proceedings to also look at open access monographs, book chapters, edited collections. So in some respects, this isn't as big a change as being able to put data or code in a repository, but I think it's still an extension of the role of the repository beyond what's most traditionally been placed there. So taking the UKRI policy as an example, they allow the version of record of a book to be made open access. That could be through the publisher, but again, where that can't happen, the author's accepted manuscript can be made open access under a Creative Commons license and subject to an embargo. So there's a recognition books are at an earlier stage in terms of the journey to open access. The policy still permits a 12-month embargo. But what this is going to drive in the UK, and I think in other countries where similar mandates have been contemplated, is a much higher rate of deposit of books into repositories. And one of the key challenges with books is very often they will include third-party content, they'll include other materials that the author may not have the right to make available under an open license. And there's a lot of extra complexity simply due to the length of books and the potential for third-party materials to be included, which are then going to place pressures, I think, on librarians and repository managers to ensure that they're able to openly share the entirety of that manuscript. So I think that's another challenge that repositories will have to grapple with in the coming years, driven by this evolving policy environment. But I think just taking a step back, the last of the three challenges I want to talk about is something called platform capitalism. And really, this is much bigger than the research landscape, the repository landscape, but this is what we're seeing in society at large, is that big platforms, and in general terms, we're talking about the likes of Amazon or Facebook or Google, many aspects of the digital economy are starting to be dominated by a small number of generally for-profit platforms. And I really like this quote. It's from a policy paper exploring what platform capitalism is about. Is, I think, for many parts of society, there is this trend towards everything being on one platform, and that has a lot of unintuitive and counterintuitive consequences, which are not necessarily a positive. So if all research everywhere is on one platform, superficially, that seems like a good thing, in the sense of you can find everything in one place, but who controls that platform? How much money can they extract from that process? There's a lot of risks associated with the platform model. And of course, traditionally, repositories have been a kind of counterbalance to the power of the commercial publishers in offering another route through which route can be disseminated. And I think in many ways, that's even more important today, as we see so much consolidation in the publishing landscape, a small number of publishers holding ever larger shares of the market. So I think repositories as a counterbalance to those sort of dominant commercial platforms are really important. But what we also see in the repository landscape is repositories themselves moving away from historically being open source software, not-for-profit solutions, towards greater use of commercial repository software. So I've included here a diagram from Carnegie Mellon Universities from a paper published a few years ago by Shearer and Valen. And KiltHub in the bottom left is Carnegie Mellon's repository. Their idea is of a comprehensive repository that does many of the things I've been talking about. It holds outputs in the sense of peer-reviewed articles, but it can also hold long-form outputs, and it holds data. But it is a commercial solution. It's the Figshare software, and it needs to be integrated with all of these other parts of the institutional research lifecycle, as well as offering interoperability with other parts of the landscape. So certainly what we see in many of the institutions we work with is perhaps a move towards using repository solutions that are tied into a wider library management software or current research information system. But potentially this is locking things into that same platform issue that we're seeing in other parts. So I think what I believe Kathleen's going to talk about in terms of interoperability is really crucial as a counterbalance to seeing so much content locked up within a small number of commercial platforms. So that was everything I wanted to share. Just to recap, reproducibility, that need to provide code and data to make research more reproducible. Those drivers of policy change, which we see particularly in relation to things like the rights retention strategy of Coalition S, this move to long-form outputs. But I think this bigger concept of the move to platforms and needing to have a counterbalance to that. So I will stop there, but I hope that's given us some food for thought to set up the discussion.
Absolutely. Fantastic insights there. Thank you very much for the presentation. I would like to transition to interoperability because communities are the social glue for interoperability. On this front, the Confederation of Open Access Repositories Co. Brings together individual repositories and repository networks in order to build capacity, align policies and practices, and sort of act as this global voice for the repository community. Kathleen, Co has a membership of over 150 institutions worldwide from over 40 countries on all 5 continents. What are some interoperability issues that you have been hearing, and that maybe you can share with us some important trends and action points for the repository community to narrow down priorities for future investments when it comes to interoperability?
Sure, I'm very happy to, and thanks again for the invitation to present here at this webinar. I very much agree with what Rob has said in his brief presentation, and I think My presentation will follow along nicely from what he's said, the groundwork that he's laid. So let me share my screen, and I will start with a brief presentation to kind of go over the history of repository interoperability and what we're thinking about in terms of where we can go in the future. So as you mentioned, Sally, CORE is an international association. We were launched in 2009 based on a European project, actually, that was connecting repositories in Europe. And of course, at the end of that, project, the leads said, well, wait a minute, we actually need a global repository network because research is international. So they launched the organization CORE, and I became the executive director in 2013. And our vision really is very much is very similar to what Rob was talking about, which is this global knowledge commons based on an interoperable network of open access repositories. And we actually had our annual meeting 3 or 4 weeks ago in Madrid, and our keynote speaker was Bjorn Brems, and he presented a very compelling reason or rationale for this global knowledge commons that we're trying to build. And he's a researcher, and he basically presented, ideally what he would like to have in terms of scholarly communication infrastructure. So he would like to have available data, code, pre-registrations, other types of materials, interpretation in this global knowledge commons, openly available, dynamic, interacting with peer review communities and other types of services. So our vision really is based on a number of different principles, and I think these principles are really important, and some of Rob's comments speak to them very, very concretely. So our vision is really around a distributed network, not a centralized network. And this, the term bibliodiversity has become more common in the dialogue in scholarly communications. And it's very much like biodiversity, right? Like we want a very healthy scholarly communication system that supports diversity, diversity of domains, diversity of different types of content, different languages, different research priorities from different countries and regions. So this is very hard to support that kind of diversity if this system is overly centralized. So we very much are trying to promote a distributed system. And, I think the point that Rob made around the fact that it's easier in a way to think of how a centralized system can support the needs has to be balanced with the potential risks around what will happen if the system is completely centralized. And so our second principle is really around interoperability and not integration. So we certainly recognize that there is this increasing integration in the scholarly communication landscape. We're seeing it especially with the commercial sector that are buying up new services and integrating them together and offering these range of workflow services to the institutions. But I think, we also can see that this is leading to significant vendor lock-in. It kind of stifles innovation because what happens is then if you've integrated too many services, you can't change the functionality of those services very easily. So we really support the idea of strong interoperability across a distributed ecosystem, but trying to avoid integration as much as possible. And I think we have a solution that's going to help with that, that I'll speak to in a few minutes. And then, of course, I probably don't need to say this, but of course, we want a system that's open access in particular, but ideally also based on open source software and so on, rather than a closed system. And I think, if this content is openly available, it really allows the research community and society to extract maximum benefit from the content that we've produced through research. It also, of course, will address some of the existing inequalities in the system. We know that researchers at lower resourced institutions, and in particular in developing countries, are not able to access the content that's relevant to their research domain, often because they don't have the financial capacity to do so, and they don't have an institution that can license or subscribe to those journals or other types of content. So those are our principles of our vision around interoperability. And I just thought I'd show you a small survey that we did about a year ago with our national members at CORE about what are the most important barriers related to consolidating the global network of repositories. And it's not really the issue of interoperability that came to the top of the pile here. It's under-resourcing and underfunding for repositories, which I think is quite a well-recognized problem. And in my travels and my interactions with repository communities, I do notice also a trend towards shared infrastructure to try to help the issues of underfunding. And I think there's a growing realization that even though we want a distributed environment, not every institution necessarily needs to have their own repositories. There is an opportunity to share some of those services across institutions. This is, I hope you can read this, but I'll read it out anyway. This is basically a quote of my colleague, Paul Walk, who is a technical advisor for CORE. And he says that repositories were originally designed as digital libraries and content management systems, rather than resource-oriented. And therefore, they do not really reflect highly the highly network architecture of the web. And this is one of the challenges we have. And this is something that we're trying to address in one of our projects that I'll speak about in a minute. So very briefly, the current repository systems, the interoperability built into repositories at the moment is really around common metadata and how that metadata is exposed. So we have these harvesters that pick up our metadata and they put them into aggregations, and we build discovery layers on top of those that metadata aggregation. And that's essentially what is the basis, the foundation for repository interoperability right now. But as you mentioned, Sally, we had been doing some work at CORE starting in 2016 to look into common behavior. We call them behaviors, because the idea really is we want this global network of repositories. We want a variety of repository systems and platforms to thrive in this ecosystem. But in order to build value-added services on top of collective repository content, we need to have common behaviors and common functionality at the different repository systems. So we launched a project in 2016 called the Next Generation Repository, which identified a number of use cases, behaviors, and technologies to support increased and improved interoperability and functionality of repositories that would also allow them to live together in this ecosystem, even though they're using different systems. So just a few of these that I'd like to highlight. One is, of course, machine accessibility, and there's a lot of discussion now about FAIR, metadata, and so on. So this is really creating a repository service that allows crawlers and others to get into the content, not just the metadata. The second thing here is bi-directional linking between repository resources and other services. And this is essentially building and linked data, the functionality of linked data notifications to be sent back and forth from repositories to repositories or other services. And this is what we're building through the Notify project, which I'm going to briefly present to you in the next slide. And of course, PIDs, persistent identifiers, are important in this landscape. And then the other functionality is really to be able to export. So we want machines to get into the content in repositories, but we also want to be able to export content. And this is really to support those functionalities, for example, of reproducibility, or to export data, for example, that needs to be analyzed in different software programs. So we know that we will never be able to provide those often domain specific functionalities in a kind of a general repository platform. But what we can do is allow researchers to take the data out and do the analysis somewhere else. And I think it's important to note that this is not just about technology, right? Like, we really need people. Because there's some things that technology can't do. And I think there's a certain level of curation that needs to be done to really make this global knowledge commons very effective and functional. So we need some level of data curation, and certainly some level of metadata curation. So this is people power. And for me, this is an obvious role for libraries moving into the future. I think we should be thinking about increasing our staffing around the curation of our repositories and digital content in general. So just briefly, CORE launched in January 2021, the Notify project. And as I mentioned earlier, the aim of this project is to use linked data notifications functionality to connect repositories with other services. And this is what Paul was talking about as resource oriented. So what it means is connecting, for example, a preprint in a repository with an external peer review that might be done by a peer review community elsewhere. So just to give you an example, as an author, you might deposit your preprint into a repository. An automated request would be sent to a peer review community to ask for a peer review. That peer review service would reply, yes, we will do the peer review, and so on, back and forth. So this is the kind of functionality that we're building in the Notify project. Not only could it be used, I mean, there are almost unlimited use cases for this kind of functionality in repositories. So not only could it be used for linking articles in peer review, it could link articles with code, and link articles with research data, and code with research data. So the idea really is to create this very, very interlinked environment, not from service to service or repository to repository, but from resource to resource. And we, for your information, we've just announced that we received quite a large grant by the Arcadia Foundation to fund this project. So we have a 4-year project that we're launching starting on July 1st to really start with the early adopters of this, but then also implement this linked data notification into many of the open source repository platforms. And so this is my last slide. I hope I'm not running over time, but I think
that's fine.
Okay, good. The elephant in the room for me is really that we have this wonderful vision around open science, and it's being very well received, especially by funders and so on. But still, we haven't really aligned our incentive system and our funding mechanisms to support advancing this wonderful ecosystem. So what we need to do in the next few years is not only talk about policies to support open science and require open science, but also redirect some of our funding towards the infrastructures that are required to support open science, and also reform some of our incentive systems so that researchers are really get credit for participating beyond just publishing in prestige journals. And with that, I say thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions people have.
Thank you, Kathleen. So it's this is an invitation for all of you joining us today. If you have any questions for Kathleen or for Rob, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A section, or just raise your hand and then you can jump into the conversation. At this point, I would like to turn towards future directions and bring into discussion where we are with institutions and even publishers. Where are they heading towards? What plans or policy or technology do you foresee in the continued interaction with open access repositories? So here I would like to know both your thoughts. So please don't hesitate to weigh in, Rob and Kathleen.
Do you want to go first, Rob, or should I go?
You go ahead.
Okay, yeah. No, I mean, I think I alluded to two of the things that I wanted to say. One is moving away from every institution needing to have their own repository. So I think there is a growing awareness that that institutions want an institutional view on their research outputs, but that institutional view doesn't mean you have to run your own repository service. So, for example, Japan is an interesting example of this, because Japan centralized at the National Institute of Informatics. They essentially host over 700 Japanese institutional repositories. And so I think a number of countries that I've been working with are looking at the feasibility of this kind of centralized hosting. And that's especially for those smaller institutions that really just don't have the technical capacity or the staffing to be able to run an institutional repository. So that's one of the trends I'm seeing. And then, of course, the technology, which I'm very hoping will emerge as and become widely adopted, is the Notify protocol with the using linked data notifications for, again, resource to resource communication across the landscape.
Right, because you have this huge difference between disciplines, and not to go and mention the avalanche of information and data that's out there, you also have this substantial gap and difference between disciplines. And from a technical point of view, it's also the question about the feasibility to host such a huge amount of data across disciplines.
Can I just come in on the future trends? I think we've sort of touched on some of these, in that different forms of research outputs. I think that point about reform of research assessment, I do see funders now talking much more seriously about that, and institutions as well, than they have for previous years. So I think there's a lot of factors pushing in kind of positive directions. I guess we also have to just acknowledge that the world is going through quite a troubled period right now. If you look at the kind of wider political landscape, anything that relies on international collaboration has become more challenging in recent years. So obviously, for a few years, we've seen kind of rising tensions between the US and China. China's already the most significant sort of producer of publications. We've now got Russia, Ukraine. Obviously, being in the UK, we see a lot of the tensions between the UK and Europe following Brexit. So I think there's a number of things pushing in the direction of greater openness in terms of greater collaboration within the scientific community. But at the global political level, there's a number of factors that are pushing towards more fragmentation, lack of cooperation. So kind of how these two things interact, I think, will have a big impact on the way things go in the future, and whether we actually see, more fragmentation, less collaboration because of that interaction between the scientific and the political levels.
Right. So maybe at this point, we will hop onto the Q&A. I see Arif, would you like to maybe unmute yourself and direct your question to the panelists?
Yeah, sure. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, you can. Great. So this is Arif Shearer from Qatar National Library. First of all, thank you both, Kathleen and Rob, for the brief but very wonderful presentations, very informative. So my question is, it's a bit of a question and perhaps a bit of a thinking out loud. It is related to interoperability, and I find this concept of using linked data to kind of enable communications between repositories for various use cases that kind of go beyond the scope of the repository itself, at least in its sort of core operational capacity. And part of my question is sort of ties into the reproducibility aspect of the data that's being disseminated through these repositories. I can't help but wonder that whether the deeper challenges are more related to either lack of understanding or lack of standards for describing what you're trying to actually present through the repository and how to present that. So I'm kind of alluding to standardized, not just standardized data models, but also standardized service models. Because when an institution is sort of embarking on developing a repository, the first thing that comes to the mind, like, okay, I understand I've got a repository to disseminate or publish this data set, but what would be the functionalities? I mean, I understand there's this, the traditional publication model of, depositing something and having it reviewed, then initially, and eventually publishing it. But is it the same for everything? Is it the same for every discipline? And different technology vendors come with their flavors of these workflows, if you will. So an institution, regardless of their, their capacity, whether it's financial or sort of technical, would always sort of face these challenges, and the answers to these questions aren't often clear enough. And some of the things, Kathleen, you mentioned about the, some of the standards for such as the OAI PMH, Dublin Core, but they were originally designed for publications. But now that we're dealing with data sets which have, finer nuances and sort of complexities around the life cycle associated with the data sets, how they're produced and how they sort of came to be and their eventual sort of, life after the project is completed, for example. So do you think the interoperability question goes more into either the lack or lack of standards related to data models or metadata or service models, or they just lack of understanding of how these should be used in an efficient and sort of sustainable manner? I'm not sure if I made myself clear, but that's sort of thinking out loud part.
Yeah, I mean, so I think the OAI PMH is a very basic interoperable metadata, format that allows for discovery. I mean, it was developed basically to harvest basic metadata into an aggregation to support discovery. So it doesn't work, for example, for reproducibility of data. I mean, if you have data in your repository, you want to have a lot more granular and descriptive metadata there to explain what that data is. An article, in a sense, can explain itself, but data cannot. So I think what we need to have is flexibility in terms of the granularity of metadata in the context of the repository itself. But the layer of interoperability in that metadata will, just by its very nature, because we're trying to get international interoperability, will be at a very basic level, I think. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. I think, part of the reason why the metadata currently is not in very good shape. I mean, and it's not just repositories. I think Crossref, people have said to me, Crossref metadata is not very not very well curated as well, is just that we haven't, as a community, placed a priority on this aspect of the scholarly communication ecosystem. And so I just think we need to think about employing more staff members, supporting researchers who this is also new to them in terms of depositing data. So they need a lot of handholding and help. And then just like local data curation and metadata curation at our repositories writ large, whether they're institutional or domain-based repositories.
Is open source an important element when it comes to repositories?
Maybe just to come in on that, I mean, I think historically it's been absolutely central, I think, and it's been very closely tied together with, the repository kind of hosts open access content or outputs and is built on open source software. I think in some parts of the world we are, and I'd say it's true in the UK, which I'm most familiar with, we are seeing a move towards more commercial software, and I think it's rather similar to the what we've seen with the move to open access, where for many years open access had sort of twin goals. So one of them was to make content more open. The other was to make the landscape sort of less the best, I guess, to address the sort of monopoly that many of the commercial publishers had over publishing. And sometimes we've got to kind of recognize there's different goals here and different objectives. So is it about making content open, where you don't have to use an open source repository to do that? A commercial solution could do that. But is it about offering a sort of distributed, community-owned infrastructure as an alternative to the kind of enclosed commercial infrastructures? Well, then open source probably is quite important. So I think it gets right to the heart of what a repository is for. And I'd love to hear sort of Kathleen's view on that. What would you say, Kathleen?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a strong supporter of open source, and I think for the reasons that you pointed out, in terms of commercial control and trying to have freedom from an industry that's sort of maybe looking at the inside of your data, but the repositories managers that I work with seem to all prefer open source because it gives them more control over the system that they're working on. There's still many challenges, and I think the reason why repository managers choose to go with commercial solutions is usually because they just don't have the technical staff on hand to be able to manage the upgrades and so on that come with using an open source solution. So yeah, I think the preference is open source because it takes those risks away. But the reality is that there are just a number of institutions that don't want to deal with the technical debt that comes with open source, or don't have the staffing and technical expertise to deal with it.
Right. We have another question from Yasin. He wants to know, so as Rob mentioned about global and political challenges, issues, how can we as people be able to collaborate off political but international? Is it possible?
A really good question. And I think yes, it is possible, and in most cases, a lot of things remain at the political realm and don't have to disrupt those kind of scientific or these sorts of interactions. I suppose what I've seen in the last couple of years is that sort of bleeding of issues from the kind of political realm into actually directly affecting scientific collaboration. So obviously, the kind of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a great case in point, where over the last few months, a lot of countries, and particularly European countries, have consciously excluded European partners from projects. Russian partners from projects. A number of international collaborations, kind of Russian scientific input has been excluded. But we've also seen others saying, why punish Russian scientists for the actions of the Russian government? So I think the principle of trying to maintain cooperation and collaboration internationally is a really important one, and almost whatever's happening at the political level, maintaining that as long as possible, because all of these interactions help to build, international solidarity, collaboration. Science diplomacy is a real thing, and in many cases, this is what's being facilitated by having those kind of global infrastructures. So I think it is possible and it's important, but in some respects, it is becoming more difficult as the world evolves and we see some of these wider geopolitical issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's especially so in places where there's conflict. So we have members from many countries around the world, and we find that as soon as there's a conflict in a certain country, we lose touch with those members, because obviously they're preoccupied with conflict in their countries. So I see conflict having a huge a huge political conflict having a huge impact on the ability of people to be able to collaborate. And then I think there are some countries that tend to be more internal, or they move from looking very much internal into their own region and are less interested in research collaboration or collaboration in terms of infrastructure. So we kind of see waves of some countries becoming collaborative and then stopping with their collaboration, and depending on the political circumstances in their country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are closing in on the hour, so maybe one final question/comment. So one of our attendees has remarked, it is important to remain pragmatic on metadata curation development. At a time of reducing budgets for libraries, institutions, we may need to aim for pragmatic and sustainable metadata curation, as there will not be enough resources, human or otherwise, to allocate to this. The question is, can't we instead aim for technological solutions in metadata curation?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can. There's some metadata that you can, with data, it's much more difficult. I mean, you can maybe extract from the data what program it was used to generate the data or so on. From articles, you can automatically extract often like the author and the title and even funder sometimes, date, so on. So there's some of that, but the reality is there's a lot of money in the system. And so I don't think it's a lack of resources. It's where the resources are being directed at the moment. And, I think in the transition from where we are now to where we want to be, we can think about how to move some of those resources towards the things that we think are important. The other model I'm seeing evolve around data curation is shared curation activities across institutions. So there's something called the Data Curation Network in the US, where there are research librarians who share the curation of metadata and data across their institutions, leveraging the domain expertise of the different librarians. So I think there are some models like that as well as maybe implementing or relying on technology to help extract some of that information.
Did you want to comment on that as well, Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree with what Kathleen said. I'd also add, there's sort of two areas technology can help. So one is in the creation of the metadata in the first place. And as Kathleen says, that's really difficult with a data set or something. But I think the other is in when that metadata already exists somewhere, how do you propagate that elsewhere in the global system? And that to me feels, there's probably a lot more scope to deliver improvements there. So we've looked at the book's metadata landscape and so on. And, what tends to happen is the same metadata is being created over and over again in different places. You look at a co-authored publication going into multiple repositories. Very often you'll have repository managers in each institution creating the same metadata for that. So I think using technology, and essentially it's back to interoperability again, if it's easier for that metadata to be passed from the place where it was created to other places it's needed, that starts to save a lot of time and effort, and is technologically perfectly possible. It's just having those interoperability links.
Well, we are close to an hour, and on that note, I will round up this webinar. But first, on behalf of all of you who are joining me today, and also those of you who are watching this replay, I would like to thank Kathleen and Rob very much for their time and for their valuable insights. Please do not hesitate to follow us on the YouTube channel, on the LinkedIn and Twitter channels. We'll be communicating about our future webinars there. Not to mention, the slides from this webinar will be hosted on the YouTube replay. And on that note, I wish you all a very good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. And thank you for being a part of this discussion. Have a great day.